Clara felt the biting chill of the marble floor through the thin soles of her shoes, a cold that had nothing to do with the autumn evening and everything to do with the cavernous emptiness of her own home. Blackwood Manor, an estate valued at a staggering $800 million, was a palace of polished stone and gilded ceilings, yet for Clara it had become a prison of exquisite misery. Her fingers, raw from polishing the family silver, ached with a dull, persistent throb. She was preparing for a party, a celebration she had no part in, thrown by her husband Richard for a woman who was not his wife. Richard entered the grand dining hall, his presence sucking the very warmth from the room. He was a man sculpted from arrogance, his suit perfectly tailored, his smile a weapon of casual cruelty. Beside him, draped in emerald silk and dripping with diamonds, was Isabella. She was beautiful, sharp, and predatory. Her eyes scanning the room, not with appreciation, but with the cold calculation of a conqueror assessing new territory. "Clara, darling," Richard's voice was smooth, like oil slicked over broken glass. "Do try to make yourself scarce tonight. We have important guests arriving, you understand." He did not wait for an answer. Isabella's gaze fell upon Clara, a slow, deliberate smirk spreading across her lips. Around her neck, glittering under the chandeliers, was a sapphire necklace. It was Clara's mother's, a piece Richard had sworn was lost years ago. Seeing it now nestled against Isabella's skin was a physical blow, a theft of memory that left Clara breathless. "The silver looks almost acceptable," Isabella commented, her voice a high, musical sneer. She ran a finger over a candelabra, checking for dust. "For a moment I thought you might have forgotten your duties." Clara said nothing. Years of this treatment had taught her that silence was her only shield. Her voice, her opinions, her very presence were treated as an inconvenience, a stain on the perfect facade of Richard's life. She was the ghost at their feast, the silent servant in a home that was supposed to be hers. Later, as the orchestra played and champagne flowed, the humiliation became a public spectacle. Richard and Isabella held court, laughing with their guests, their bodies always in close contact, a hand on the small of her back, a proprietary arm around her waist. Clara was relegated to the shadows, instructed to ensure the catering staff were efficient. She moved along the edges of the room, her simple grey dress a stark contrast to the glittering gowns of the other women. She felt invisible, and she knew that was precisely how Richard wanted it. The inciting moment, the one that would shatter her carefully constructed dam of endurance, came without warning. Isabella, holding a glass of deep red wine, glided over to where Clara was quietly directing a waiter. "Oh, Clara!" she exclaimed, her voice laced with false concern. "You look so pale. Are you feeling all right?" Before Clara could respond, Isabella stumbled, a theatrical, clumsy movement that sent the entire glass of Bordeaux cascading down the front of Clara's dress. A collective gasp rippled through the nearby guests. The dark red stain spread across the light grey fabric like a fresh wound. Isabella brought a hand to her mouth in mock horror. "Oh my goodness, I'm so terribly clumsy. Look what I've done to your dress." The pause was deliberate, her eyes flicking over the simple garment with disdain. Richard appeared at her side instantly, but his concern was not for Clara. He wrapped an arm around Isabella, pulling her close. "It's all right, my love. Accidents happen." He then turned his cold eyes on Clara. A cruel laugh escaped his lips. "Well, look at you. More of a mess than usual. For God's sake, go and clean yourself up. You're an embarrassment." The laughter of the guests followed her as she fled, a chorus of mockery that echoed the laughter she had heard in her head for a decade. She ran up the grand staircase, her cheeks burning with a shame so profound it felt like a physical fever. She didn't go to the master's suite, a room she hadn't been welcome in for years. Instead, she went to the small, sparse room in the east wing that had become her sanctuary, her cell. There, with the distant sound of the party still audible, she sank onto her narrow bed. The humiliation was a poison seeping into every part of her. It was in this moment of absolute despair that her eyes fell upon the object on her nightstand, a small, leather-bound journal. It was the only significant thing she had left from her grandfather, a quiet, scholarly man who had raised her after her parents passed. She picked it up, the worn leather cool against her trembling hands. Her grandfather had been a man of few words but deep thoughts. His journal was filled with observations on history, philosophy, and nature. But there were also cryptic entries she had never understood, phrases that seemed out of place. True ownership is not a matter of proclamation, but of quiet possession, one read, and another, patience is the key that unlocks the vault. Wait for the fruit to rot before the harvest. Tonight those words felt different. They were no longer the ramblings of an eccentric old man. They felt like a map, a secret whispered across time. Her fingers traced the embossed cover, a strange new resolve beginning to harden within her. The party downstairs could continue. Richard and Isabella could have their laughter and their wine. They believed they had won. They believed she was nothing. But as she sat there, the smell of spilled wine still on her ruined dress, Clara felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a very long time. It was the cold, hard glint of a key turning in a long rusted lock. The harvest, she thought, might be closer than anyone knew. The story of Clara and Richard had begun, like many stories, with a deception. Richard had met her at a university fundraiser. She was quiet, unassuming, volunteering to serve drinks. He saw a plain girl from a simple background, a blank canvas upon which he could paint his masterpiece of a life. Her family, as far as he could tell, consisted of a single living relative, an elderly, reclusive grandfather, Elias, who lived in a modest cottage and spent his days reading dusty books. Richard saw her as malleable, a wife who would be so grateful for the life he provided that she would never question him, never challenge him, never demand more than he was willing to give. He had courted her with a calculated charm, showering her with just enough attention to win her over. Clara, who had known little but the quiet love of her grandfather, was swept away by this worldly, ambitious man. She mistook his confidence for strength, his possessiveness for passion. They married within a year. It was only after the wedding, after she had moved into the sprawling grandeur of Blackwood Manor, that the facade began to crack. Richard had told her the estate had been in his family for generations, a legacy of wealth he was now building upon with his own brilliant business acumen. He spoke of his ventures, his investments, his genius in the marketplace. In the early years, Clara had tried to take an interest, to be a partner to him, but her questions were always met with condescension. "Don't you worry your pretty little head about it," he would say, patting her on the head as if she were a child or a pet. "I'll handle the important things." His cruelty was a slow-acting poison. It started with small dismissals, then escalated to open contempt. He criticized her clothes, her manners, her lack of social grace. He told her she was a reflection of her poverty-stricken upbringing, a relic of a simpler, lesser world. He isolated her, ensuring her only human contact was with the staff, who were instructed to treat her as little more than a high-level manager of household affairs. The arrival of Isabella 2 years ago had marked the final stage of Clara's descent into irrelevance. Isabella was everything Clara was not: glamorous, assertive, and utterly ruthless. She was Richard's partner in ambition and in cruelty. Their affair was not a secret, it was a performance. They took a perverse pleasure in flaunting their connection in front of Clara, each shared laugh and lingering touch a fresh turn of the knife. Their worldview was simple and brutal. The world was divided into winners and losers, the powerful and the weak. Wealth was not just a means to an end, it was a measure of human worth. They saw Clara's kindness, her patience, her quiet endurance as pathetic weaknesses. They genuinely believed they were superior beings, entitled to their happiness at any cost, their social standing propped up by the immense wealth tied to Blackwood Manor was the foundation of their entire identity. Without it, they would be nothing, and they were certain it was all theirs. In the days following the party, the weight of a decade of humiliation pressed down on Clara. Richard's cruelty, once a dull ache, had become a sharp, unbearable pain. She found herself returning again and again to her grandfather's journal, searching for meaning in his cryptic words. One night, her fingers brushed against a slight bulge in the back cover. Prying at the stiff leather, she discovered a hidden compartment. Inside was not a letter, but a single, ornate brass key and a small, folded note. The note was in her grandfather's familiar spidery script. It contained only an address: Thompson and Associates, 14th floor, Sterling Tower, City Centre, and a single sentence: "When the fruit is rotten, it is time to harvest." The phrase from the journal. It was a direct instruction. This was the moment he had prepared her for. A tremor of fear and excitement ran through her. For the first time she was not just enduring, she was on the verge of acting. Meanwhile, Richard and Isabella were escalating their own plans, drunk on their perceived power. They were convinced of Clara's complete and utter weakness. One evening, as Clara silently served them dinner in the small dining room they preferred, she overheard their conversation. They made no effort to lower their voices. "I'll have my lawyer draw up the divorce papers next week," Richard said, swirling his wine. "We'll give her a token settlement, just enough to keep her from making a fuss. She can go back to whatever hovel her grandfather left her." Isabella laughed, a sound like shattering crystal. "A token settlement? Richard, you're too generous. She deserves nothing." She leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "Before you do that, you should prove your commitment to me, to us." "And how should I do that, my love?" he asked, captivated. "This house," Isabella said, gesturing around the room. "I want it to be ours, truly ours. I want you to sign half of it over to me." A grand gesture, something that proves I'm not just a mistress anymore. I am the future lady of this manor. Richard's chest puffed out with pride. The idea appealed to his sense of drama and his desire to inflict a final, crushing blow. "A brilliant idea," he declared. "I'll do it. I'll arrange it for next week. We'll have a formal signing right here in the library. We'll even make Clara watch. She needs to see her replacement formally take her throne." They clinked their glasses together, sealing their pact. They laughed, confident in their victory, completely unaware that the woman clearing their plates was not a victim on the verge of eviction, but a queen on the verge of reclaiming her kingdom. The fruit was not just rotten, it was beginning to fall from the tree. The train ride to the city was a blur of green countryside and grey suburbs. Clara sat by the window, clutching the brass key in her pocket, its sharp edges a comforting reality against her palm. She felt like a spy in her own life, sneaking away for a few hours while Richard and Isabella were out for the day. Sterling Tower was an imposing spear of glass and steel, a world away from the quiet, manicured grounds of Blackwood Manor. She felt small and out of place as she stepped into the marble-floored lobby, Her simple coat and worn shoes a stark contrast to the sharp suits and clicking heels of the people rushing past her. The offices of Thompson and Associates on the 14th floor were hushed and elegant, smelling of old leather and lemon polish. A receptionist with a polite but firm smile looked at her expectantly. "May I help you?" Clara's voice was barely a whisper. "I have an appointment. My name is Clara." She had called from a payphone the day before, giving only her first name, as instructed by a faint pencil marking on the back of her grandfather's note. The receptionist's professional demeanour softened slightly. "Of course, Mr. Thompson is expecting you." She was led down a corridor lined with portraits of stern-faced men and shown into a large corner office. A man who must have been in his late 70s rose from behind a massive mahogany desk. He was tall and thin, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. This was Mr. Thompson. "Miss Clara," he said, his voice warm and gentle, "I have been waiting a very long time to meet you. Your grandfather was a dear friend." He gestured to a comfortable chair opposite his desk. "Please, sit." Clara sat, her nervousness slowly receding under the calm of his presence. She placed the brass key on the polished surface of the desk between them. Mr. Thompson nodded, a knowing look in his eyes. He picked it up and walked over to a large, unassuming painting on the wall. He swung it aside to reveal a formidable steel safe. He inserted the key along with one of his own, and with a heavy clunk, the door swung open. He returned to the desk and placed a thick, leather-bound portfolio in front of her. "Your grandfather, Elias, was a remarkable man," he began softly. "He was also one of the wealthiest men in the world. He just chose not to live like it." Clara stared at him, her mind struggling to process his words. Wealthiest men in the world? Her grandfather? The man who wore patched cardigans and drove a 20-year-old car? Mr. Thompson opened the portfolio. Inside were dozens of documents filled with dense legal text, charts and figures that made her head spin. He patiently began to explain. Her grandfather wasn't a retired librarian. He was a legendary, pioneering investor who had built a multi-billion-dollar empire in technology and real estate. A recluse who hated the ostentatious displays of wealth, he had constructed an elaborate network of trusts and shell corporations to manage his assets anonymously. "And at the very center of that empire," Mr. Thompson said, tapping a specific document, "is a corporation called CG Holdings, the sole owner of which is you." He slid the paper across the desk. Her name, Clara Genevieve, was printed in clear black ink. The revelations came one after another, each more staggering than the last. Blackwood Manor, the $800 million estate Richard claimed as his birthright, was owned entirely by CG Holdings. It had been purchased by her grandfather decades ago. The vast fortune, the portfolio of stocks, the international properties, it was all hers, placed in an ironclad trust that she alone controlled upon her 30th birthday, which had been 6 months ago. Richard owned nothing, absolutely nothing.
"But how?" Clara stammered. "Richard, his businesses, he's so successful." A sad smile touched Mr. Thompson's lips. "Your grandfather was a brilliant man, but also a cautious one. He worried that any woman he loved would be pursued for her fortune. So he created a test. This entire arrangement was designed to see what kind of man you would marry." He explained that Richard's title was nothing more than an estate manager, a position that granted him access to generous operating funds and the illusion of ownership, but no legal claim whatsoever. Richard's successful business ventures were all elaborate fictions, secretly and strategically funded by the trust. Every deal he bragged about, every investment that paid off, was orchestrated by Mr. Thompson to prop up the facade of his genius. Richard's entire life, his identity as a powerful tycoon, was a carefully constructed lie funded by the very woman he held in contempt. The irony was devastating.
The wealth he used to humiliate her was her own. The home he lorded over was hers. The power he wielded was a gift she had unknowingly given him every single day for 10 years. Clara leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking like an old church door. The years of pain, of feeling worthless and small, began to recede, replaced by a cold, clarifying anger. The humiliation of the party, the sting of Isabella wearing her mother's necklace, the casual cruelty of Richard's laughter. It all coalesced into a single point of decision. She looked at Mr. Thompson, her eyes no longer filled with the timid uncertainty of the woman who had walked in an hour ago. They were clear, steady, and hard as diamonds.
"My grandfather's note," she said, her voice low and firm. "It said it was time to harvest when the fruit was rotten." She took a deep breath, the air in the quiet office seeming to crackle with new energy. "Mr. Thompson, the fruit is rotten to the core." A slow, approving smile spread across the old lawyer's face. He had been waiting for this moment. "I am at your service, Miss Clara. What is your first instruction?" Clara thought of Richard's arrogant plan to sign away half of her house. She thought of Isabella's triumphant smirk.
And she knew exactly where to begin. "My husband is planning a grand gesture," she said, a hint of steel in her voice. "He intends to sign a document transferring 50% of Blackwood Manor to his mistress. I want you to draw up those papers for him. I want them to look perfect, official, and absolutely binding." Mr. Thompson's eyebrows raised in understanding. "An excellent strategy, using his own arrogance as the instrument of his downfall. Your grandfather would be very proud." They spent the next hour mapping out the plan. It would be surgical, legal, and devastating. While Mr. Thompson's firm prepared the meaningless transfer documents, they would also prepare the real paperwork. Notices of asset seizure, letters recalling all lines of credit, legal notifications to the boards of Richard's companies, informing them that their sole investor had just pulled 100% of their funding, effective immediately. The collapse would be total, and it would be timed to coincide perfectly with the moment Richard signed his name with a triumphant flourish. As Clara left the office, the city lights were beginning to glitter in the twilight. She no longer felt small or out of place. She felt a power she had never known, a power that came not just from the billions in her name, but from the reclamation of her own soul. The sleeping giant was finally awake. Richard was about to learn the true meaning of ownership, and the lesson would be a brutal one. The week leading up to the signing was a masterclass in dramatic irony. Clara moved through the halls of Blackwood Manor with a newfound serenity that Richard and Isabella mistook for defeated resignation. They saw her quiet composure and assumed she had finally accepted her fate. Her placid exterior was the perfect camouflage for the storm gathering within. She served their meals, managed the household, and endured their condescending remarks with a calm that unnerved them, though they couldn't articulate why. "She's probably in shock," Isabella whispered to Richard one evening, watching Clara clear the table. "The poor thing is realizing her pathetic little life is about to be over." Richard chuckled. "Let her be quiet. It's more pleasant this way. Soon we won't have to look at her sad face at all." Behind her serene mask, Clara was in constant, discreet communication with Mr. Thompson. The plan was in motion. The pieces were being moved into place with the precision of a grandmaster playing chess. The fake documents were ready, printed on heavy, watermarked paper that radiated authority. The real legal actions were queued up, waiting for a single command to be executed simultaneously. The day of the signing arrived, a crisp, clear autumn afternoon. Richard had orchestrated the event with all the pompous theatricality he could muster. He had summoned his own high-priced lawyer, a slick man named Gerald, to witness the proceedings. A notary public, a stern-looking woman, was also present. The stage was set in the Manor's grand library, a room panelled with dark oak and lined with thousands of books Clara's grandfather had curated over a lifetime. Richard, feeling magnanimous in his victory, had insisted Clara be there. "She needs to witness the transfer of power," he had told Isabella. "It's important for her to see what she has lost." So Clara stood quietly in the corner of the library, dressed in a simple navy blue dress, holding a silver tray with a porcelain tea set. She was once again playing the part of the servant, a role she now embraced with a chilling sense of purpose. She watched as Isabella swept into the room, radiant in a crimson dress, her face flushed with triumph. Isabella walked around the library as if she were already its queen, running her hands over the furniture, already planning her redecoration. "All these dreary old books will have to go," she announced to Richard, wrinkling her nose. "I'm thinking of turning this into a media room, a massive screen right there, perhaps." She pointed to the wall where a priceless 16th-century tapestry hung, a gift to Clara's grandmother. Clara poured the tea, her hands perfectly steady. She felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching a play whose ending she had already written. She observed their gloating, their casual destruction of her family's legacy, and felt only the cold, satisfying click of the final tumblers falling into place in a very complex lock. Mr. Thompson arrived, punctual as always. He was introduced as the estate's representative, a role Richard accepted with a dismissive wave. "Thompson, good of you to come," Richard boomed, all magnanimity. "Just here to dot the I's and cross the T's. A simple matter." "Of course, Richard," Mr. Thompson said, his expression politely neutral. He placed his briefcase on the table and took out the prepared document. While Richard and his lawyer gave the papers a cursory glance, confident in their meaning, Mr. Thompson discreetly sent a text message from his phone. It was a single word: execute. Miles away, in law offices and bank headquarters, a flurry of activity began. Emails were sent, phone calls were made, digital commands were issued that would, in a matter of minutes, dismantle Richard's entire fabricated empire. The first domino had been pushed. Richard took his seat behind the massive oak desk that had once been Clara's grandfather's. Isabella stood behind him, her hands possessively on his shoulders. He picked up a heavy fountain pen, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He looked directly at Clara, his eyes full of scorn and pity. "A historic moment, wouldn't you say, Clara?" he mocked. "The end of an era, and the beginning of a much better one." With a dramatic flourish, he signed his name on the final page. The notary applied her stamp with a decisive thud. "It's done," Richard declared, rising from his chair to kiss Isabella passionately. "It's all yours, my love, half of this magnificent place, our future." He turned back to Clara, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. "See that? That is the signature that erases you. Now get ready to pack your bags. You have 24 hours to be off this property." The room was silent for a moment, thick with Isabella's triumphant glee and Richard's smug satisfaction. Then Mr. Thompson cleared his throat. The sound, though quiet, cut through the atmosphere like a blade. "There appears to be a significant misunderstanding, Richard," he said, his voice calm and measured, yet carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. Richard turned, annoyed by the interruption. "What misunderstanding? It's perfectly clear. I just signed half of my estate over to my future wife." "Not exactly," Mr. Thompson corrected gently. He picked up the document Richard had just signed. What you have just signed is a legally sound document transferring 50% of your total ownership stake in Blackwood Manor Properties, LLC, to Miss Isabella. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. The problem is that your total ownership stake in that entity is, and has always been, precisely 0%. A confused frown creased Richard's brow. What nonsense are you talking about? This estate has been in my family for— No, it has not, Mr. Thompson interrupted, his voice hardening now. Blackwood Manor was purchased 35 years ago by the sole shareholder of a company called CG Holdings. You were hired, for lack of a better term, as an estate manager, with a generous stipend and certain privileges to maintain the illusion of ownership. An illusion your benefactor was keen to maintain. Richard stared, his face a mask of disbelief. Isabella's triumphant smile began to falter. Benefactor? What are you talking about? Who owns this house? Mr. Thompson turned his gaze toward the corner of the room, to the woman holding the silver tea tray. Allow me to introduce you to the sole owner of CG Holdings, the sole owner of Blackwood Manor, and the sole beneficiary of the $9 billion Elias Vance Trust. He gestured with an open hand. Your wife, Clara. The silence that followed was absolute. It was as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. Richard and Isabella swiveled their heads to look at Clara, their expressions shifting from triumph to utter, slack-jawed shock. Clara met their gaze, her own expression unreadable. She placed the tea tray down on a nearby table with a soft click. Richard was the first to break, a strangled, sputtering laugh escaping his lips. "You're insane! She's a nobody! Her family was— they were nothing." "Her grandfather was Elias Vance," Mr. Thompson stated flatly, placing the thick portfolio from their first meeting onto the desk. "One of the most astute and private investors of the last century. And this," he said, tapping the portfolio, "is his last will and testament, along with the articles of incorporation and the trust documents. I believe your own lawyer, Gerald, will find them to be perfectly in order." Gerald, who had been frozen in place, snatched the documents. His eyes, trained to read complex legal text at lightning speed, darted across the pages. The colour drained from his face. He looked up at Richard, his expression grim. "He's right, Richard. It's ironclad. The ownership is indisputable. It all belongs to her." The reality of the situation crashed down upon Richard with the force of a physical blow. His face contorted, twisting from disbelief to panic, and then to a terrifying volcanic rage. "No, it's a trick, a lie!" he roared, lunging for the papers, but Gerald held them away. Isabella let out a shrill cry. "What is this? Richard, what have you done? You told me you owned everything." She turned on him, her adoration instantly curdling into furious accusation. "You lied to me!" "I didn't lie. I always thought—" Richard stammered, his mind reeling, trying to reconcile a decade of belief with this new, catastrophic reality. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. It buzzed again, insistently. He pulled it out. It was a text from his bank. "Credit alert. All accounts frozen pending review." Another alert popped up. "Card declined." And another. An email from the CEO of his flagship company. "Urgent! Funding pulled. We're insolvent." The digital collapse was happening in real time, right in the palm of his hand. His empire, his identity, everything was vanishing into thin air. He looked up, his eyes wild with desperation, and they landed on Clara. It was then that Clara finally moved. She stepped forward from the shadows, her posture no longer stooped with subservience but straight and regal. The timid, invisible woman was gone. In her place stood the lady of the manor. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it filled the vast library, each word delivered with the cold, precise impact of a hammer striking stone. "You spent 10 years, Richard," she began, "treating me like dirt under your shoe. You mocked my family, you belittled my intelligence, you shamed me in my own home. You paraded your affairs in front of me, all while living in my house, driving my cars, and spending my money." She took another step closer, her eyes locked on his. "What you didn't know was that my grandfather, the man you dismissed as a poor, eccentric old librarian, valued character above all else. This entire decade was his test, and you failed miserably." Then she turned her gaze to Isabella, who was now weeping, her face a mess of mascara and disbelief. "And you," Clara said, her voice dripping with ice, "you celebrated in a home that was never yours, wearing a necklace that belonged to my mother, a necklace you will be taking off before you leave. You dreamed of being the queen of a castle that belonged to me. The party is over." Clara walked to the doorway and spoke to someone in the hall. 2 large, uniformed security guards stepped into the room. "These 2 are trespassing," Clara announced, her voice ringing with finality. "They are to be escorted from the property immediately. They will leave with nothing but the clothes on their backs and their personal effects. Everything else, the cars, the jewelry, the art, was purchased with funds from the trust. It stays." Richard let out a primal scream of rage and denial, lunging toward Clara, but the guards intercepted him effortlessly, pinning his arms behind his back. "You can't do this!" he shrieked, his face purple with fury. "You're nothing! You'll pay for this, you snake!" Isabella, hysterical, began tearing the sapphire necklace from her throat, the clasp breaking and the stones scattering across the polished floor. "Take it! Take your stupid necklace!" she sobbed, as the guards firmly took her by the arm. Clara watched, unmoved, as they were half dragged, half pushed from the library, their curses and sobs echoing down the long hall until they were finally silenced by the heavy front door slamming shut. The library was quiet again. The notary and Richard's lawyer Gerald stood frozen, looking like statues in a museum of disaster. "I believe your business here is concluded," Mr. Thompson said to them calmly. They scurried out without another word. Clara stood alone in the center of the vast room, the room where she had been made to feel so small for so long. She looked at the scattered sapphires on the floor, glittering like fallen stars. She didn't bother to pick them up. She simply took a deep, cleansing breath, the first truly free breath she had taken in a decade. The harvest was complete. The downfall of Richard and Isabella was as swift as it was brutal. Stripped of their assets and cast out of the opulent world they had inhabited, they found themselves utterly adrift. The news of their public humiliation spread like wildfire through the elite social circles they had once dominated. The story was too sensational to be ignored. The powerful tycoon revealed as a fraud, his glamorous mistress left with nothing, and the quiet, forgotten wife emerging as a secret billionaire heiress. The society pages that had once lauded Richard's business prowess now feasted on his spectacular collapse. Their shared adversity did not unite them. It exposed the transactional nature of their relationship. They turned on each other with a viciousness born of desperation. Isabella sued Richard for fraud, claiming he had deceived her about his wealth. Richard in turn publicly blamed her for goading him into the disastrous property signing. Their bitter public feud only served to cement their pariah status. Without the trust's invisible support, Richard's businesses imploded overnight. He was hounded by creditors and sued by investors he had misled. Forced into bankruptcy, he lost everything. The last Clara heard, he was living in a small, rented apartment, a bitter, broken man consumed by his own rage and regret. Isabella, stripped of her benefactor, faded back into the obscurity from which she had come, her brief, glittering moment in the sun extinguished forever. Justice, Clara found, was not always loud. Sometimes it was simply the quiet, inevitable consequence of a life built on lies. Clara, in stark contrast, did not embrace the extravagant lifestyle her fortune afforded her. She had seen firsthand how wealth could corrupt, how it could become a tool for cruelty and arrogance. Her victory was not about embracing opulence, it was about reclaiming her peace and her purpose. Her first act as the true lady of Blackwood Manor was to give the entire staff a significant raise and assure them of their job security, treating them with a kindness and respect Richard had never shown. She worked closely with Mr. Thompson to understand the full scope of her grandfather's empire, proving to be a quick and intuitive study. She discovered that her grandfather had earmarked a significant portion of his fortune for philanthropic endeavors. Honoring his spirit, she established the Elias Vance Foundation, an organization dedicated to providing legal aid, financial support, and counseling to victims of domestic, financial, and emotional abuse. She poured her energy into building it, finding a profound sense of purpose in helping others who, like her, had been made to feel powerless. Blackwood Manor itself began to transform. Under Clara's direction, the cold, ostentatious showpiece became a home again. She replaced the gaudy furniture Richard had favoured with the comfortable, elegant pieces her grandmother had chosen, which had been stored in the attic. The dreary books Isabella had despised were cleaned and cherished. The house began to breathe again, filled not with the tension of performances and parties, but with quiet warmth. Part of this restoration involved reviving the manor's neglected gardens. Mr. Thompson recommended a talented landscape architect named Mark, a man known for his gentle approach and his deep respect for historical properties. Mark was kind, patient, and unassuming. He listened to Clara's ideas with genuine interest, and his passion for bringing the gardens back to life was infectious. He saw Clara not as a billionaire heiress, but as a thoughtful woman with a deep appreciation for beauty and history. Their conversation started with discussions of heritage roses and garden layouts, but soon drifted to talk of books, music, and life. For the first time, Clara found herself in a relationship built on mutual respect and shared interests, not on deception and power dynamics. With Mark, she could be herself without fear of judgment or ridicule, but a new, healthy love began to bloom, as gentle and natural as the flowers they were planting. Months later, Clara stood on the grand terrace overlooking the newly restored gardens. It was a perfect summer evening. The air was fragrant with the scent of jasmine and roses. Mark stood beside her, their hands comfortably intertwined. She was wearing a simple, elegant sundress, not because it was all she could afford, but because it was what she liked. She felt a profound sense of peace, a contentment that ran deeper than any bank account. She looked out at the sprawling estate, at the magnificent house that was finally her home. Her journey had been one of unimaginable pain and extraordinary vindication. She had lost herself in the shadows of another's cruelty, but in the end she had found her own light. True wealth, she now understood, was not measured in dollars or acres, nor was it displayed in lavish parties or glittering jewels. True wealth was integrity, kindness, and the quiet strength to endure. It was the freedom to be oneself and the peace that comes from a life lived with purpose and love. Those who built their empires on foundations of greed and deception would always see them crumble, for such structures could never withstand the simple, unyielding force of the truth. Clara's victory wasn't just about reclaiming her fortune, it was about reclaiming her life, and in doing so, she had become richer than Richard could ever have imagined.